Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I've been driving cabs for years, so I thought I'd seen it all. Late-night drunks, people who think the cab is a confessional, the occasional stray dog darting across the road. But that night changed everything. The rain had been coming down like it was trying to drown the city, turning the streets into a wet mirror that reflected everything and nothing all at once. The headlights cut through the fog, but even they couldn't pierce the thickness of it. I had no business being out there, really. But that's the thing about being a taxi driver. You don't get to pick when you're working or where you end up, you just drive. I remember the night being quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's watching, waiting. I was used to the hum of the engine, the soft chatter of passengers, but tonight, it felt like the whole city was holding its breath. That's when I saw him, standing there on the corner, beneath a flickering streetlight. He wasn't like any passenger I'd picked up before, he was just still. And I mean still. Not a single movement, like he was carved out of stone. His coat was long, dark, and soaked, the rain pouring off him like a waterfall. But his eyes were hidden under the shadow of his hood. I didn't even know if he was looking at me, but he raised his hand, signaling for a ride. Something about it felt off. Something deep inside me told me to drive away, to forget this whole thing. But you don't get to be a taxi driver for as long as I have without ignoring the small alarms that go off in your head. And anyway, I was tired. Too tired to think about anything but getting the job done. I pulled over and unlocked the door, and without a word, he climbed into the back seat. The door clicked shut with a hollow thud. I didn't hear him speak, not at first. He just sat there, his face hidden in the dark, staring out the window into the night like the city was nothing but a passing blur. I tried to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. You get used to asking that question 1,000 times a day, but this time the words felt strange, almost too loud in the heavy silence. He didn't look at me, didn't even move. His voice was low, like a whisper that got caught in the air. "Just drive. I'll tell you when we're close." I nodded, not sure why I was still going along with it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the feeling that there was something else going on here, something beyond my understanding. But I put the car in drive and rolled away from the curb, the wheels slicing through the wet pavement, the rain beating against the windshield like it was trying to make me listen. The further we went, the stranger it got. The roads I was taking didn't look familiar. I'd lived in this city all my life, but these streets? No, they weren't right. The buildings seemed to lean toward us, too close, like they were crowding in on the car. The streetlights flickered and buzzed above, casting an eerie glow on everything below. It was like the city itself was trying to hide from us. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, trying to catch a glimpse of him. His face was still in shadow, but his eyes, they were different now. They weren't human. Not in the way I understood. They were hollow, cold, and yet searching. Searching for something, maybe, or someone. But not for me, no. I was just a passenger in this ride. I asked him again, voice rough with a tinge of fear. "Where exactly are we headed?" The air in the car thickened, heavy like it was soaking up all the sound. The passenger didn't answer right away. Then, in that voice, barely audible, as if it were being dragged from the depths of the earth, he said, "We're almost there. Almost where? I didn't dare ask. I was beginning to feel like I wasn't even in control of the car anymore. The fog outside pressed closer, swallowing the road ahead, and the world seemed to fade, leaving only the headlights, the rain, and that low, rhythmic sound of the wipers fighting against the storm. The city had slipped away. The familiar streets, the neon lights, everything was gone. Instead, we were moving through what felt like a forgotten part of the world. A place untouched by time or memory. The buildings here weren't the clean-cut skyscrapers or aging storefronts I was used to. They were cracked, crumbling, half sunk into the earth like they had been left behind by someone who had forgotten to come back. And there he was, still sitting in the back seat, staring into the distance, his face hidden beneath the hood. I felt his presence now, more than I saw it. A chill crept into the car that had nothing to do with the rain. My breath fogged up the window, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I opened my mouth to ask him where we were, what was going on, but the words stuck in my throat, choked out by the suffocating silence. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. That's when I saw it. He was staring at me through the mirror, his eyes no longer empty but filled with something I couldn't name. His lips barely moved, but I heard him, clear as day. "We're almost there," he said. But this time, his voice wasn't just a whisper, it was urgent. Like the words were trying to claw their way out of him, trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear, and then the fog thickened, swirling around the cab like it was trying to keep us in. The air grew colder still, and the streetlights ahead began to flicker, casting long, erratic shadows across the car. I swear I saw something, someone, standing just off the road, half hidden in the fog, a figure barely visible. But then it was gone, swallowed up by the night. I didn't know where I was anymore. The city, the roads, they didn't make sense. And the man, the passenger, he was still there, still quiet, still waiting. I don't know what possessed me to drive on. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was something darker, pulling me forward. But I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, and we continued into the fog, deeper into a place I couldn't even name. And I knew, somewhere deep in my gut, that I was going to see something tonight I wasn't ever meant to witness. But I didn't stop. Because once the ride starts, you don't get to quit. I've been behind the wheel for more years than I care to admit. But I've learned a thing or two during those countless nights, winding through the same streets, picking up the same faces, hearing the same stories. You get used to it, the rhythm of the ride, the hum of the engine, the way the city keeps moving, indifferent to everything and everyone. But that night, something was different. I didn't know it then, but I was about to drive straight into something I couldn't explain. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It pelted the windshield relentlessly, turning the streets into rivers, and the air was thick with fog that seemed to seep into everything. I could barely make out the street signs as I cruised along, my mind somewhere between awake and asleep. The only thing I could hear was the monotonous beat of the wipers swishing back and forth, clearing the glass for a split second before it was covered again by the downpour. The world outside felt distant, muted, like it belonged to someone else. I didn't think much of it at first. Not the man. Not the way he looked standing under that flickering street lamp. But something pulled at me, some instinct, or maybe just pure fatigue. He was tall, drenched in the rain, his long coat hanging heavy around him. He stood there like he'd been waiting forever, like he didn't belong to the city, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I slowed the cab to a stop and unlocked the door. He raised his gloved hand, signaling for a ride. There was something unnerving about it, something that gnawed at the back of my mind, but I was too tired to care. This was just another passenger, right? So I didn't think twice when I let him in. He slid into the back seat without a word. His coat was soaked, dripping rain onto the floor mat, but his eyes were hidden. He didn't look at me. He didn't even seem to notice me. I tried to get a better look at him through the rearview mirror, but all I could see were shadows, dark and heavy. "Where to?" I asked, my voice thick with fatigue. The man didn't answer at first. He just sat there, still as death. His silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't like anyone I'd ever heard before. It was distant, like it was coming from some faraway place. Something older than the city itself. "Just drive. I'll tell you when we're close," he said, his words like whispers on the wind. I didn't question it, at least not yet. I put the car in drive and pressed the pedal. The streets outside the window blurred as we moved further into the heart of the city. But as the miles passed, the roads grew narrower, darker, more unfamiliar. It was like the city was slipping away behind us, and the world around us was changing. The buildings that lined the streets were crumbling now, their facades peeling away, the windows dark and empty. It felt like we were driving through an abandoned place, a ghost town that the world had forgotten. I glanced back at the man again. He hadn't moved. His face was still hidden in the shadow of his hood, but I could feel his presence. Something about him was wrong. He wasn't alive, not in any way I could understand. He sat there, staring out the window into the fog, his figure too still, too perfect, like he was carved from stone. "Where exactly are we headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence that was choking me. He didn't answer at first, but I could feel his eyes on me through the rearview mirror, cold and empty. Then he spoke again, his voice softer this time, like he was speaking to someone else, someone far, far away. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" I wanted to ask, but I didn't. The words caught in my throat, swallowed by the tension that was building between us. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the fog outside had thickened, and the lights seemed to disappear into the mist. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of the cab. It was like the world was dissolving around us. And that's when I noticed it. The way the road was changing, the buildings were decaying further, and the air inside the cab had grown colder, despite the heat blasting from the vents. My breath fogged up the windshield. I tried to turn the heat up again, but the dial wouldn't budge. It was like the whole world was freezing in place, and I was the only one who hadn't noticed. The passenger, still silent, didn't seem bothered by it. In fact, it was like he was waiting for something, something that was coming, something that was already here. I could feel it in my bones. Finally, the passenger spoke again, but this time his voice was different. There was a weight to it, a heaviness that filled the air. "Do you know what happens to people when they don't finish their journey?" he asked. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry, tight. I didn't answer him. My eyes were glued to the road, but the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just driving anyone. I wasn't taking some lost traveler to their destination. This was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I couldn't look back at him. I didn't want to. "We're almost there," he repeated, his voice growing colder. "And you'll see." See what? I thought. What did he mean? The streets had become unfamiliar, twisted, like they had been rearranged in some terrible dream. The buildings loomed closer, their broken windows staring back at us, and the rain. It hadn't stopped. But it wasn't just rain anymore. It was something else, something older, falling like dust from the sky. I couldn't make sense of it. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A building. A crumbling, forgotten structure that looked like it had been here for centuries. It was dark, its windows shattered, the door ajar. It looked abandoned, but somehow familiar. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt in front of it. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I couldn't take my eyes off the building. Something about it was pulling me in, calling me forward. The passenger opened the door without a word. He stepped out into the fog, his figure blending into the mist, disappearing from sight. "Wait," I yelled, but my voice was lost in the wind, swallowed by the fog. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to follow. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. But I couldn't stop myself. I threw open the door and stumbled out of the cab. The air was icy, like death itself had crept into the world. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there, waiting for me. And that's when I saw it. In the doorway of the building. A flash of something, someone, hanging lifeless from the rafters. The truth hit me all at once. This wasn't just a ride. This wasn't just some strange passenger. I was taking him back to where it all ended. And once I finished the ride, there would be no turning back. I've been a taxi driver long enough to think I'd seen it all. The drunks, the late-night passengers, the occasional freak who wants to tell me their life story, and the ones who simply want to be left alone. But none of them ever felt like this. That night was different from the moment I picked him up. The rain had been relentless, falling in sheets that distorted the city around me. The streets were slick, the headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that seemed to have swallowed everything whole. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The world was just a blur of dark shadows and streaking light. I wasn't paying much attention, just doing my job, trying to get through the shift. And then I saw him. A figure standing alone in the middle of the street, bathed in the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. He didn't look like anyone I'd seen before. Tall, gaunt, wrapped in a dark coat that hung from his frame like it was too heavy for him. His face was hidden under the hood, but I could tell he was staring directly at me. The moment I saw him, something inside me snapped. A warning signal, a feeling that I couldn't shake, told me not to stop. But of course, I did anyway. I pulled over, unlocked the door, and let him in. No words, just the creak of the door and the soft sound of him settling into the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I started to drive, but I couldn't see his face. He was just there, still, silent. Something about him was wrong, and the longer the silence stretched between us, the more it clawed at me. "You got an address?" I finally asked, trying to fill the air with something. Anything. He didn't respond at first. His eyes stayed fixed on the fog outside, his posture so rigid it was like he wasn't even alive. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a voice so soft, it barely cut through the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. "Just drive. I'll tell you when we're close." I didn't think much of it then. It was strange, sure, but who was I to question a passenger? I was just the driver. But the longer I drove, the more I felt the city around me change. The streets were unfamiliar, twisting in ways they shouldn't. The buildings looked different, older, decaying. I tried to shake it off, chalk it up to fatigue, but it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something in the air was off. The temperature had dropped. I could see my breath fogging up the windshield, and the car's heat wouldn't kick in. It was like I had driven into a different world. I glanced back again, trying to catch a glimpse of the man. His face was still hidden in the shadow of his hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. Cold, empty eyes. They weren't right. Nothing about him was right. My gut told me that the longer he stayed in the back seat, the more I'd regret it. But I kept driving. I had to. I had no choice. "Where are we headed?" I asked, my voice a little shakier this time. The man didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, he spoke in that same distant whisper. "We're almost there." His words struck me like a blow, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something in the way he said it made my heart skip a beat. I wasn't just driving somewhere. I wasn't just taking him to some random address. No, I was being led somewhere. We were being led somewhere, and I had no control over it. I tried to shake off the dread building inside of me, but the roads around me kept getting more twisted, more alien. I was driving into a place I didn't know, a place I couldn't name. The streets were darker now, more narrow. I was on the edge of something I couldn't explain, something that felt ancient and wrong. That's when I saw it. A building. It wasn't just any building. It was broken down, half collapsed, like it had been left to rot for decades. But the thing that got to me wasn't the building itself. It was the feeling it gave me. Like I had been here before, or like I had seen it in a dream. I slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a stop in front of the building. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to drive back to something familiar, to safety. But before I could act on it, the man opened the door, stepped out, and disappeared into the fog. I sat there for a second, frozen. My head was spinning, the confusion and fear hitting me all at once. What the hell was going on? I could feel my breath quicken, the panic setting in. "Wait!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Where are you going?" But there was no response. He was gone. I didn't know what was worse, what had just happened, or the fact that I was still sitting there, watching that empty doorway. My fingers gripped the wheel tighter, but the fear wouldn't let go. That's when I heard it. A voice. Soft, calm, but enough to make my blood freeze in my veins. "Are you all right, Frank?" I jerked around, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see something, anything. But instead, there was just the same regular passenger I'd seen countless times before. The one who always rode quietly in the back seat, never saying much. The one who seemed to have no real place in the world except inside my cab. But now, he looked different. He looked knowing. Like he understood something I didn't, something I didn't want to understand. "What the hell are you doing here?" I stammered, my voice shaking. He looked at me with those calm, unreadable eyes. "I thought you knew," he said, his voice so level, so matter-of-fact. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" I didn't answer. What could I say? How could I answer when every bone in my body was telling me to run, to get out of here, to leave? He ignored my silence, his gaze drifting over my shoulder, back to the darkened building. "It's not real, Frank, not in the way you think." I stared at him, confused. The fog thickened around us, swallowing us whole. "What the hell are you talking about?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his figure emerging from the mist like he wasn't even human anymore. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You think you're in control, but you're not. You never were." The fear inside me was growing, suffocating. "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat tight. "You're just part of it, Frank. This ride, this place, it's all part of something much older than you, much darker." I felt my knees weaken. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wasn't just driving some random passenger to an unknown destination. I had crossed into something I wasn't meant to see, something I couldn't escape from now. The regular passenger turned to face me, his face still calm, his eyes empty but knowing. "You have a choice," he said, his words like the final bell tolling in my mind. "You can stay or you can finish the ride." His ride, I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew this much. The choice had already been made for me. I had already been dragged into something I couldn't escape from, and now there was no turning back. I've been a taxi driver for so long that I thought nothing could really scare me anymore. I've seen it all, drunks stumbling into my cab, people telling me their life stories, others too tired to even speak, just staring out the window. But that night, that ride, changed everything. I thought I knew what fear was. I was wrong. It started like any other night. The rain came down in sheets, the city's streetlights barely cutting through the fog that wrapped around the streets like a suffocating blanket. I was too tired to care about the weather, just trying to get through the shift, trying to make it to the end of the day. The hum of the engine was a comfort, the familiar sound of tires slicing through wet asphalt, the rhythm that had become second nature to me. But when I pulled over to pick up that passenger, I felt it, the wrongness. He was standing under a flickering streetlight, his figure almost blending into the shadows. Tall, wrapped in a long, dark coat, the kind that might look out of place in the city if it weren't for the fact that everything about him seemed out of place. His face was hidden under the hood, and he didn't say a word when I opened the door for him. Just slid into the back seat without a sound, like he had been waiting for me. I don't know why, but I felt something cold in the pit of my stomach. I should have turned him away, should have driven off, but I didn't. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the silent command in his presence that made me too scared to argue. I started driving, asking him where he wanted to go. "Just drive," he whispered. "I'll tell you when we're close." It wasn't like any passenger I'd ever had. He didn't talk, didn't make any noise beyond his breathing, which I barely even heard. The quiet between us was thick, oppressive. I glanced back at him once in the rearview mirror, and that's when I first noticed it. The way he was staring, his eyes hidden beneath his hood, but still, I could feel them on me, waiting. It was like he was searching for something, looking for a way into my head, into my soul. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. It wasn't just him. The streets around us were changing. The city I knew, the city I'd driven through for years, was vanishing, slipping away like it was never really there. The buildings grew older, cracked and crumbling, their windows dark, their facades rotting. I didn't recognize the roads anymore, the path I was on becoming more twisted, more unnatural with every turn. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice thick, the fear in me rising. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want this man in my cab anymore. "We're almost there," he whispered. His voice was a chill that crawled under my skin, something ancient in the way he spoke, like the words had been formed long before we ever met. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a ride. This wasn't about some simple destination. We weren't headed to a street address or a hotel. We were headed somewhere else, somewhere darker. I pushed the thought from my mind, but then the air changed. It grew colder. My breath fogged up the windshield, and I tried to adjust the heater, but nothing happened. The dials wouldn't budge. The warmth from the vents had turned to ice, like it wasn't supposed to be there. The city, the road, everything outside became wrong. The fog thickened, swirling around us like it had a mind of its own. I felt it closing in on the car, pressing against the windows, pulling us deeper into this nightmare. We passed through streets that were familiar at first, but now nothing looked the same. Every corner turned into another twisted alley, every building older, more decayed. I looked back at the passenger again. His face was still hidden beneath that hood, but now, I could feel him. I could feel his eyes burning into me. He was closer than before. And he wasn't just watching. He was waiting for something to happen. The car finally skidded to a stop. I didn't know how I had gotten here, this place, this street, this building. But when I saw it, I felt it deep in my bones. This was it. This was where we were meant to be. The passenger didn't speak. He opened the door, stepped out into the fog, and disappeared into the darkness. I was left in the car, staring at the building in front of me. It was ancient, like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't just old, it was wrong. The walls were crumbling, the windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges like it had been waiting to fall apart for years. But worse than that, worse than the decay, was the feeling. The sensation that something had been waiting for me here. I wanted to leave. I wanted to drive away. But I couldn't. My body refused to listen to my mind. My feet moved of their own accord, pulling me out of the car, dragging me toward the building. The air was thick, the fog swirling around my legs like it was trying to drag me under. I felt it in the pit of my stomach. The dread. The realization that something had been guiding me here all along. I walked toward the door, and that's when I heard it, the voice. Frank. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, low and hollow. My name, pulled from the very depths of the darkness that surrounded me. My heart raced as I stepped into the building. Inside, the temperature dropped even further, as if the air itself had frozen. The light was dim, barely a flicker from a single hanging bulb. The walls were cracked, covered in grime and dirt, but there was no dust, no sign of neglect. It was as though it hadn't been abandoned, but preserved, waiting for someone to find it. And as I walked deeper into the room, I saw it. The body, the passenger, or at least what was left of him. His body hung from the rafters, suspended in the air, his arms and legs limp. The lifeless form swung gently, as though it had been there for years. His face was twisted, distorted, frozen in an expression of pain. But it wasn't just the body. It was the presence, the suffocating weight in the air, the feeling that everything around me was alive in a way I couldn't explain. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the man I had driven to his final destination. And then, the truth hit me. This wasn't a ride. I hadn't just been driving some random passenger. I hadn't just been doing my job. I had been part of this, part of his unfinished journey. I turned to run, but the door I had come through was gone. It had vanished. There was no escape. The walls closed in, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't just trapped in some forgotten part of the city. I was trapped in a place that didn't exist. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Finish it, Frank. You have to finish the ride." And that's when I knew. The ride had never been about taking him somewhere. It had been about taking me to the place where I could never turn back, and now I was part of it, part of something far older, far darker than I could ever imagine. The fog closed in around me, and there was no way out. I've been a taxi driver for years, long enough to think I've seen it all. The drunks, the late-night passengers, the weirdos who seem to think I'm their therapist. But nothing prepared me for the night that would change everything. It started out like any other night. The rain came down in sheets, pounding against the windows, the city streets glistening beneath the flickering streetlights. I could barely make out the road ahead. The fog was thick, pressing against the car like it had a mind of its own, swallowing everything it touched. I was tired, exhausted even. I could feel my eyelids drooping, the hum of the engine lulling me into a state of half-sleep. I should have been focusing, should have been paying attention. But my mind was wandering, lost in the monotony of the night, when I saw him. A figure standing at the corner, shrouded in shadows, barely visible beneath the flickering light of a street lamp. Something about him didn't sit right, like he didn't belong there. But before I could think, my hand was already unlocking the door. He raised his gloved hand, silently asking for a ride. I pulled over. He climbed in without a word, without a sound. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but he was still, motionless, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. There was a chill in the air, one that had nothing to do with the cold rain outside. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling clung to me. "Where to?" I asked, my voice a little shaky, though I tried to mask it. He didn't answer at first, just sat there, staring out the window, the fog swirling outside. It felt like we were both in a world of our own. "Just drive," he said softly, his voice a low murmur that barely cut through the silence. "I'll tell you when we're close." I didn't question it. I just started the car and drove. But the longer we went, the more I began to notice something strange. The streets were unfamiliar. I'd driven these roads 1,000 times before, but this time, nothing looked right. The buildings seemed older, their walls cracked and decaying. The city I thought I knew was slipping away, replaced by something darker, more sinister. My pulse quickened. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, hoping to catch a glimpse of the passenger's face. But his hood was still pulled low, his eyes hidden. It was like he wasn't even there, like he was a part of the darkness itself. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice more urgent this time. I tried to push past the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. "We're almost there," he whispered, his voice colder than the air in the cab. Almost where? I thought. The streets continued to narrow, the buildings leaning closer, as though they were pressing in on us. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it only grew stronger, the silence between us stretching like a noose around my neck. The headlights of my car barely cut through the fog. It felt like the world was closing in. I wanted to turn around, to drive away, but something held me there, kept me moving forward. Then we arrived. I didn't even know how we got there. One moment, I was driving through an unfamiliar street, and the next, I was staring at a building that had no business existing. It was old, decaying, its windows shattered, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. The kind of place you'd walk past and never look at twice, a place forgotten by time. But I couldn't look away. It called to me in a way I couldn't explain. The passenger opened the door, stepping out into the fog without a word. I wanted to yell after him, to ask what was going on, but I couldn't move. Something kept me rooted in place. He disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the darkness. I sat there for a moment trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest. What was happening? And then I heard it. "Are you all right, Frank?" I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. A voice I knew, a regular passenger, the man who always rode in the back seat, polite but distant, never one to ask for anything more than a ride. But now, something was different. The way he stood, how he looked at me, it wasn't the same. He was calm, but there was a coldness to him now, a detachment that unnerved me. "What are you doing here?" I stammered, still trying to make sense of everything. "I thought you knew," he replied, his voice low and unsettling. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" I was still shaking my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. "What do you mean?" The man's gaze shifted past me, toward the building, his eyes narrowing as if he already knew everything. "This," he said, his voice suddenly colder, sharper. "This isn't real, Frank, not like you think." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? I don't understand." He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're here because you have to be. You can't leave, Frank. You've already been a part of it. The ride, the man, it's all part of something much darker. And now, it's your turn." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "My turn," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "You've already done it," he said, his voice lowering. "You've already taken him where he needed to go. You've finished the ride." I staggered backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you mean?" I gasped. "Where did he go?" But the man didn't answer. His gaze flickered again toward the building, and I followed his eyes. The door stood open, waiting. "Frank," he said softly, "it's time for you to finish it." I felt the ground beneath me shift, as if the earth itself was warping, distorting, pulling me toward that building. I tried to resist, tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. And then I understood. This wasn't just a ride. I wasn't just some cab driver. I had been part of something far bigger than I could have imagined. The man I picked up wasn't just any passenger. He wasn't a random soul in need of a ride. He had been searching for me, searching for someone to take him here, to this place, to finish what had been started long ago. And now I was here too, trapped. The building loomed before me, the darkness inside calling, pulling me in. The air around me was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch out from the walls, reaching for me. I stepped forward, drawn into the blackness. I had no choice but to follow. And as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The ride was over, and there was no turning back. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.